The war was a distraction. The words hit the council chamber as the tactical dome replayed the first Krexar strike. Plasma flash. Orbital platform gone. 20,000 lives erased. "Pause," Jason said. The projection froze mid-explosion. Rewind 12 seconds. The dome shifted backward. Before the shot, before the advance, before the vote collapsed. A faint gravitational distortion flickered at the edge of the Kallax corridor. Background noise. Ignored. Jason stepped onto the central disk. It started here. Admiral Vorek's 3 amber eyes narrowed. "You claim manipulation. I'm stating sequence." Jason overlaid another feed. 37 border conflicts across 12 species, each one preceded by the same distortion pattern. Small, dismissed, then war. President Elena Ward's voice entered from Earth. So the war wasn't the objective. Jason folded his newspaper once. No. A beat. We were. The chamber lights flickered. Not dramatically, just enough. Across the projection, a live alert replaced the archived replay. Deep field sensor array Sigma 9, offline. No debris, no explosion, just signal loss. High Arbiter Sareth's bioluminescent veins pulsed brighter. That array is outside the corridor. Jason didn't look surprised. It's adjusting distance. A second alert appeared. Krexar navigation buoys along the outer trade lane began drifting out of alignment by fractional degrees, too precise to be malfunction. Vorek's posture tightened. That distortion is active. Jason nodded once. It never stopped. The dome zoomed outward. The ripple at the corridor's edge pulsed again. Closer, stronger, not attacking, calibrating. Jason's voice remained calm. The first shot wasn't the beginning. The ripple flared, and 3 civilian satellites blinked dark in synchronized silence. No explosion, no warning, just absence. Now the chamber understood. The war hadn't been escalation. It had been measurement. And something was still measuring.
The deep field alert didn't fade. It spread. 3 additional sensor buoys along the Kallax perimeter drifted off axis within 20 seconds of Sigma 9 going dark. Not random. Their orbital correction thrusters were firing. Against nothing. Admiral Vorek stood in the council projection. Amber bioluminescent patterns brightening along his semi-organic skin. "This is controlled interference," he said evenly. Jason Klein didn't look at the explosion replay. He looked at the timestamps. Overlay pre-salvo distortion patterns. The tactical dome complied. The archived anomaly aligned perfectly with the live ripple. Same frequency band. Same micro-oscillation. President Elena Ward's voice entered the chamber from Earth. So the first shot wasn't escalation. Jason answered calmly. It was confirmation. The chamber went still. 37 historical border conflicts appeared around the dome. Every one preceded by identical micro-distortion signatures. Small enough to ignore. Large enough to destabilize. Vorek's central eye narrowed. This forced rapid adaptation. Jason nodded once. Yes. And now, he added quietly, it measures recovery speed. A new alert cut through the chamber. Volari Agricultural Exchange Node Delta 7. 0.6% throughput reduction. Ryzen's antennae stiffened. That regulates food distribution. It regulates timing, Jason corrected. A second alert followed. Terran civilian freight grid latency spike. 0.3 seconds. Mara Eldon's cold voice came through the channel. Cross-system confirmation delays are increasing in clusters. Jason didn't blink. It's not attacking infrastructure. A beat. It's profiling it. The dome zoomed outward. The ripple expanded laterally, not toward fleets, toward economic density. Vorek's posture shifted slightly. If supply corridors destabilize, empires fracture quietly. Jason finished. A Thessian harmonic pulse shimmered across Luma's crystalline body. You cannot be certain this is coordinated. Jason responded without raising his voice. 37 precedents suggest otherwise. Silence. President Ward spoke again. What is your action plan? Jason folded his newspaper once. Activate Contingency Grid 7. Across 3 Terran systems, dormant civilian redundancy protocols came online. Embedded relay chains engaged. Independent from primary infrastructure. Invisible to standard scans. Vorek observed carefully. You anticipated distributed interference. Jason met his gaze. I anticipated pressure. A Krexar officer's voice cut into Vorek's channel. Outer Imperial logistics nodes registering micropower irregularities. Vorek's bioluminescent patterns brightened sharply. It has extended beyond Terran systems. Jason replied evenly. It was never limited to them. The dome flickered again. This time, 5 trade nodes across 3 species registered synchronization drift simultaneously. Not random. Timed. Ryzen's voice trembled. Our agricultural exports are slowing. Jason didn't soften. It just tested economic response thresholds. President Ward's tone shifted. Civilian markets will react within hours. Jason nodded. And that reaction is data. A new projection appeared. Stock fluctuations. Insurance recalibrations. Shipping contracts auto-adjusting premiums. Tiny instabilities. Multiplying. Vorek's voice lowered. This is not war. Jason's reply was immediate. It's preparation for one. The ripple pulsed again. This time, closer to the densest cluster of concordat trade relays. High Arbiter Sereth's bioluminescent veins intensified. You believe this entity intends systemic collapse? No, Jason said calmly. It intends dependency modeling. A Terran emergency ping cut through the chamber. 2 minor freight vessels misaligned during autonomous routing recalibration. No collision, but manual override required. Mara's voice sharpened. Jason, these anomalies predate the Krexar salvo by 8 days. The chamber absorbed that. Vorek's pupils constricted. It began before open conflict. Jason's expression didn't change. Yes. A beat. Long enough to map everyone. Silence hardened. The ripple adjusted again. This time it reacted to Contingency Grid 7. The interference vector shifted around Terran redundancy nodes instead of through them. Vorek saw it immediately. It is adapting to your countermeasures. Jason nodded once. Yes, but slower than we adapt. That was the first power shift. Small, but measurable. President Ward leaned forward on the holo display. How long before civilian stability degrades? Jason answered plainly. Hours for markets. Days for supply. Weeks for structural stress fractures. The numbers landed. Ryzen whispered. This is economic suffocation. Jason's voice remained controlled. No. A beat. It's rehearsal. The ripple pulsed again. Closer. Sharper. 5 satellites blinked offline across multiple species. No debris. No explosion. Just synchronized absence. Vorek straightened to full height. Then we escalate. Jason shook his head once. We don't control tempo. He stepped forward onto the central disk. This entity forced war to measure reaction speed. It now forces peace to measure fragility. The dome zoomed outward again. Trade corridors glowed faintly unstable. Economic overlays flickered in fractional deviations. Nothing catastrophic. Yet, Jason let the next line land clean. Escalation won't look like fleets. It will look like inconvenience. The ripple pulsed once more. And this time, the drift patterns synchronized across all three major powers simultaneously. Not testing one, testing cohesion. The chamber finally understood. The war had been obvious. This was precision, and it had already begun.
The ripple didn't grow stronger. It grew precise. Across the tactical dome, the oscillation stabilized into exact 12-second intervals. Jason watched it for 3 cycles before speaking. It's no longer sampling. Vorek's pupils contracted. It's predicting. A new alert struck the chamber. Terran Commercial Docking Grid Gamma 3, Autonomous Sequencing Conflict. 2 inbound freight carriers assigned identical approach vectors. Mara's voice cut in sharply. Manual override engaged. On the projection, the vessels corrected at the last second. 3 kilometers from collision. Silence followed. Ryzen's antennae trembled. That would have triggered cascading insurance suspension. Jason nodded. And panic liquidity freeze. The ripple pulsed again. 12 seconds. But this time, it encountered synchronized public confirmation. Market sell-off halted. Insurance algorithms froze. Freight sequencing held. The oscillation spacing broke. From 12 seconds to 16, then 9. Irregular. Mara's voice was controlled but urgent. It's increasing amplitude. Jason nodded. It's trying to force a divergence spike. The ripple flared. 3 minor civilian satellites blinked offline for 3 full seconds. Enough for panic, but the unified broadcast remained steady. Ward spoke clearly. We are aware of the anomaly. Vorek followed. Containment is active. Sareth's voice carried through the chamber. The concordate remains aligned. No contradiction, no delay, no visible fracture. The ripple's cadence destabilized further. For the first time since its reappearance, it hesitated. Jason watched the oscillation flatten. It built its model on reaction speed. A beat. We just changed the variable. Vorek turned slightly towards him. You anticipated cross-domain interference. Jason didn't smile. I anticipated pressure. That was the dominance moment. Not loud, not theatrical, but undeniable. The chamber saw it. Vorek had followed Jason's timing, not the other way around. Mara's final update came quietly. Predictive confidence index dropping below threshold. The ripple contracted slightly. Not retreating, recalculating. Jason delivered the closing line evenly. It expected war. A beat. It expected fear. His eyes remained on the distortion. It didn't expect discipline. The ripple pulsed again. Irregular. Watching. Learning. But no longer certain. And for the first time, it was no longer controlling the tempo alone. The ripple did not pulse. It locked. Across the projection dome, the oscillation flattened into a continuous gravitational hum. No cadence, no spacing. A sustained field. Mara's voice cut in immediately. It's no longer testing intervals. Jason didn't look away. It's committing bandwidth. Vorek's bioluminescent patterns dimmed slightly. Define,
It has stopped sampling reaction speed, Jason said. A beat. It's anchoring. The dome zoomed outward. The distortion line extended laterally across the densest trade corridor in the sector. Not spiking, overlaying. Within seconds, micro-lensing artifacts appeared along cargo routes. Freight signatures jittered. Autonomous navigation systems began recalculating continuously. Not failing, looping. Ryzen's voice shook. Our long-haul agricultural convoys are entering recursive course correction. Luma shimmered brighter. Thessian mineral exports experiencing routing indecision. Vorek's gaze hardened. This is corridor paralysis. Jason nodded once. Yes. A Terran alert flared. 3 civilian freighters stalled mid-jump exit, unable to finalize vector alignment due to fluctuating gravity microvariants. Mara's voice sharpened. They are safe, but immobile. That was the first cost. Not destruction. Stasis. President Ward spoke evenly. How long until backlog cascades? Jason answered without hesitation. 40 minutes for traffic congestion. 6 hours for trade compression. 24 for economic shock. The numbers landed heavily. Vorek stepped forward in the projection. If the corridor collapses, peripheral systems starve. Jason's reply was immediate. It won't collapse. A beat. It will freeze. Silence. Because freezing meant something worse. Sustained uncertainty. Permanent instability. The ripple intensified slightly. Not outward. Downward. Microgravity fluctuations increased along shipping lanes. Freight beacons blinked amber across the dome. Mara spoke again. It's introducing persistent variance. Jason's eyes narrowed. It's stress-testing long-duration cohesion. Vorek understood. It wants prolonged strain. Yes. Not a war. An endurance trial. A new alert appeared. Krexar outer colonies reporting delayed medical shipments due to corridor hesitation. Vorek's lower eye flickered. That delay is unacceptable. Jason did not soften. It wants you to escalate. The chamber fell silent again. Because escalation meant fleet mobilization, and fleet mobilization meant confirming its war model. President Ward spoke carefully. What is the alternative? Jason stepped onto the central disk. We decentralize. Mara reacted first. Jason, he continued calmly, we break corridor dependency. Ryzen's antennae lifted. That route carries 60% of interspecies trade. Jason nodded. Exactly. The ripple hummed louder. It was stabilizing the corridor like a weight, not crushing it, holding it in tension. Vorek spoke slowly. You would reroute supply chains across unoptimized lanes. Yes. That increases cost. Yes. That signals weakness. Jason met his gaze. No. A beat. It signals unpredictability. The chamber processed that. The ripple had anchored itself to the densest node, expecting reliance. Jason was proposing to deny it that leverage. Mara's voice cut through. Activating secondary civilian routing network Delta. Across Terran systems, dormant non-commercial jump corridors came online. Older, less efficient, but independent. Ward confirmed. Terran exports rerouting immediately. Vorek hesitated longer this time. Imperial pride resisted inefficiency. Then, Krexar outer supply nodes rerouting through auxiliary lattice. The shift was visible. Primary corridor traffic dropped by 12% in under 2 minutes. The ripple's hum fluctuated. It had anchored to density. Density was thinning. Luma shimmered. Thessian harmonic lanes adjusting reserve paths. Ryzen followed. Volari biotransport corridors activating reserve paths. The chamber watched the main corridor lose mass. The ripple responded. Its field intensified locally, trying to maintain hold. Jason watched closely. It expected centralized dependency. Vorek's central eye narrowed. It did not predict voluntary inefficiency. A replay line formed clean. Jason delivered it evenly. Efficiency is predictable. Survival isn't. A sudden surge occurred. Gravity variance spiked along one remaining dense trade cluster. 3 civilian vessels jolted violently mid-exit. Hull stress alarms flared. Not catastrophic, but dangerous. Mara's voice rose slightly. Structural strain detected. Vorak reacted immediately. Dispatch escort stabilizers. Krexar support vessels moved to reinforce the stressed cluster. Ward added, Terran gravitic dampeners assisting. For the first time since emergence, joint military and civilian assets operated in synchronized physical space. Not symbolic alignment, operational. The ripple's hum destabilized. Its field began fluctuating unevenly across shrinking density. Jason spoke quietly. It anchored to the wrong assumption. Vorak passed flatly, which was that we would cling to optimization. The corridor traffic continued thinning. Within minutes, primary throughput dropped below 50%. The ripple's gravitational hum fractured into oscillations again. Not clean oscillations, uneven surges. Mara's update came. Field coherence degrading, but not collapsing. Jason didn't relax. It will adapt. President Ward asked the question that mattered. At what cost? Jason looked at the rerouted traffic. Longer travel times, higher fuel burn, economic friction. He answered honestly. We absorb inefficiency. Vorak's posture remained rigid. And if it shifts anchor? Jason met his gaze. Then we shift again. The ripple's hum weakened further. The anchoring field flickered. Trade lanes stabilized under decentralized load. Freight routing normalized across alternative corridors. The primary corridor remained unstable, but no longer critical. That was the irreversible moment. Dependency had been broken. Not destroyed. Broken. The ripple pulsed once more. Weakly, then thinned across the main corridor. It had not been defeated. It had been denied leverage. Jason stepped back from the disk. It wanted the war. A beat. It wanted the corridor. His eyes stayed on the fading distortion. It doesn't get either. The ripple receded slightly outward. Not retreating. Observing again. Recalculating under a new variable. Unpredictability. And for the first time, it no longer knew where the center of the board was.
The ripple did not retreat. It subdivided. Across the projection dome, the fading distortion along the primary corridor fractured into 5 thinner vectors instead of 3. Not random. Targeted. Mara's voice cut in immediately. It's redistributing interference bandwidth. Jason didn't blink. It lost centralized leverage. A beat. So now it's stress testing distributed stability. Vorak's bioluminescent patterns dimmed, then pulsed brighter. Secondary corridors reporting instability? Yes, Mara confirmed. Terran auxiliary lane Delta experiencing jump-exit turbulence beyond safety margin. A new alert followed instantly. Volari biotransport cluster Gamma registering refrigeration lag spikes. Ryzen's antennae lowered sharply. That affects perishables. Another alert. Thessian harmonic routing buffers destabilizing at distributed intervals. Luma shimmered sharply. It predicted decentralization. Jason nodded once. Yes, and it adapted faster than expected. Silence. The implication was clear. It had allowed decentralization. It wanted to see how wide they would spread themselves. Now it was applying distributed pressure. The ripple intensified along 7 minor arteries simultaneously. Freight signatures jittered. Autonomous AI systems began constant rerouting loops again. Not paralysis, agitation. Vorak's voice sharpened. It seeks adaptive exhaustion. Jason met his gaze. Yes. President Ward leaned forward. How long before distributed lanes collapse under variance? Jason overlaid stress projections. If variance exceeds 3.2% across 5 or more lanes, cascading misalignment triggers within 2 hours. The numbers landed hard, because decentralized failure would look like incompetence, not attack. A Terran alert cut in sharply. Jason, Auxiliary Research Node Theta reporting sustained data corruption across archival clusters. The dome shifted to display it. Not flicker, persistent corruption. Data packets misaligning, checksum failures repeating. Mara's tone lowered. This is not turbulence. The chamber went silent. Node Theta housed civilian research, interspecies treaty archives, and arbitration precedent logs. If those records destabilized, trust itself would fracture. Vorak reacted first. Deploy defensive lattice immediately. Jason did not answer. Another alert. Concordant Arbitration Network Delta Prime auto-escalated 2 contract disputes due to archive desynchronization. Minor disputes, but public. Ryzen's voice trembled. This will generate blame. President Ward spoke sharply. Jason. He looked at the projection. Node Theta corruption percentage climbing. 4%. 5. 6. Mara's voice sharpened. If corruption hits 10%, auto-isolation protocol triggers, which meant public declaration of system breach, which meant panic. Jason made the call. Activate Grid 8. Ward did not hesitate. Authorized. Vorak hesitated. Longer than before. Imperial data sanctums do not open to foreign review. His bioluminescent patterns flared violently. The ripple pulsed again. Node Theta corruption jumped to 8%. Mara's voice cut sharply. Jason. Vorak spoke. Krexar command metrics unlocked. There it was. The concession. Sereth followed. Zenthari oversight synchronizing. Ryzen swallowed. Volari economic data streams unlocked. The projection shifted. Live cross-species correction began flowing through Node Theta. Multiple checksum endearisons from independent archives. Cross-validation from 5 sovereign systems. The corruption spike stalled at 9.3%. Then reversed. 7. 5. 3. The chamber exhaled, but the ripple responded instantly. 2 auxiliary lanes spiked simultaneously above tolerance. Gravity variance jumped to 4%. Freight vessels jolted mid-exit. 1 Terran cargo ship emitted hull stress alarms. Not catastrophic, but real. Vorak's voice cut through. Stabilization fleet deploy. Jason raised a hand. Negative. The chamber froze again. Ward looked sharply at him. You're risking a vessel. Jason's tone did not change. If we overcommit military response, it confirms its escalation model. Mara's voice tightened. Hull strain climbing. Jason spoke evenly. Route civilian gravitic dampeners from adjacent Volari lanes. Ryzen blinked. You want us to divert? Yes. A beat. Now. Volari dampeners redirected. Thessian harmonic stabilizers synchronized. Krexar escort ships held position, but did not surge. The Terran cargo vessel stabilized under collaborative correction. Hull strain dropped below critical. The ripple's distributed vectors flickered unevenly. It had expected military reinforcement. It received collaborative cooperation. Jason delivered the line quietly. It models power. A beat. It doesn't understand restraint. Vorak's central eye narrowed. You denied it escalation. Yes, but it hasn't stopped. The ripple's 5 vectors converged toward concordant arbitration nodes again, this time stronger. Public dispute channels trending with anomaly speculation. Insurance algorithms prepared escalation clauses. Mara spoke quickly, sentiment analytics spiking. Jason stepped forward. Full transparency broadcast. Ward did not ask for confirmation. Execute. For the first time in concordant history, all major powers broadcast live internal stability metrics to civilian populations. Latency curves, correction speeds, corruption reversal logs. Nothing hidden, nothing filtered. Public speculation stalled mid-surge. Insurance clauses paused. Arbitration disputes de-escalated automatically. The ripple's synchronization collapsed. Its vectors thinned into irregular oscillations. Not defeated, destabilized. Node Theta stabilized fully. Auxiliary lanes returned below 3% variance. The cargo vessel completed jump exit. Jason watched the ripple recede slightly outward. Not retreating,
recalculating again. Vorak turned towards him. You anticipated distributed aggression. Jason shook his head once. I anticipated pressure. President Ward spoke quietly. And the cost? Jason looked at the projection of longer travel times, higher fuel burn, increased coordination overhead. He answered plainly. We trade efficiency for resilience. The ripple pulsed once more, weakly, but not gone. And then, far beyond the corridor edge, a second distortion flickered, not connected to the first, smaller, colder, watching. Jason saw it. This time, he did speak. Prepare for parallel modeling. The chamber shifted again, because one manipulator was manageable. Two changed the board entirely.
The second distortion did not advance. It synchronized. Across the projection dome, the distant ripple began mirroring Concordat corrective timing patterns, not interfering, replicating. Mara's voice cut in immediately. Jason. He was already watching it. It's not probing infrastructure. Vorak's pupils narrowed. Then what? Jason zoomed the projection outward. The secondary distortion pulsed in near-perfect rhythm with Concordat response intervals. When transparency metrics updated, it echoed. When distributed lanes stabilized, it echoed. President Ward's voice tightened. It's observing in real time. Jason shook his head slightly. No. A beat. It's learning in real time. Silence. The first ripple had measured reaction speed. The second was mapping adaptation logic itself. A Terran alert appeared. External handshake request detected against Contingency Grid 7. Mara's tone hardened. It's pinging redundancy architecture. Vorak's bioluminescent patterns flared sharply. It is mapping your contingency structure. Jason didn't look surprised. Yes. The secondary distortion shifted closer by fractional degrees. Not gravitational, cognitive. It began projecting hypothetical Concordat countermeasures seconds before the anomaly spikes that would trigger them. The chamber watched in disbelief. Simulated correction overlays appeared in the dome before real instability occurred. Luma shimmered faintly. It predicts your next move. Jason replied evenly. It predicts what we would logically do. A Krexar outer command node flickered. Not corrupted, preempted. Its stabilization maneuver executed before gravity variance occurred. Automation hesitated. Because two correction logics collided. Half a second. That hesitation cost a Thessian freight carrier critical hull strain tolerance. Hull stress alarms flared. Not cosmetic, real. Luma's crystalline body flared violently. Structural integrity falling below safe margin. Mara's voice sharpened. Jason, if that strain crosses threshold. Jason stepped forward. Manual override across all affected systems. Vorak reacted instantly. You propose abandoning predictive automation entirely. Yes. A beat. It is modeling our decision trees. President Ward's voice lowered. If we disable optimization, response time slow. Jason didn't soften. If we keep it, we lose tempo. Silence. The Thessian freight carrier's hull strain rose another 2%. Crew life support metrics flickered in the projection. Real lives. Vorak's eyes burned brighter. Stabilization fleet, deploy. Jason raised his hand sharply. Negative. The chamber froze. Ward looked at him. You're risking them. Jason's voice stayed calm. If we escalate military reinforcement, it confirms its escalation model. Another half-second hesitation ripple. Hull strain at 9%. 10 would rupture. Jason spoke quickly. Redirect Volari gravititic dampeners. Ryzen blinked. That weakens our agricultural lane. Yes. A beat. Now. Volari dampeners redirected. Thessian harmonic stabilizers synchronized. Krexar escorts held formation but did not surge. The Thessian freight carrier stabilized at 9.6% strain, close enough that crew biometrics spiked across the dome. Luma's glow dimmed slightly. They remain intact. The second distortion pulsed again, projecting 3 possible stabilization paths before Concordat systems executed any. It was anticipating choice architecture itself. President Ward asked quietly, "Can it outrun us?" Jason did not answer immediately. He watched the projection. Simulated response overlays forming in advance. "Yes," he said finally, "if we remain consistent." Mara spoke carefully. "There is one option." He knew. Randomization. Vorek's eyes narrowed. "Clarify. Non-deterministic command sequencing," Mara said evenly. "Break pattern continuity across decision cycles." Ward leaned forward. "That increases risk." "Yes. It also breaks prediction." The ripple pulsed again. Simulated correction overlays accelerated. Jason made the call. "Activate randomization layer." Ward authorized immediately. Vorek hesitated. Only one breath this time. Krexar command cycles disengaging predictive optimization. Luma followed. Thessian harmonics entering stochastic modulation. Ryzen added. Volari traffic entering non-linear correction sequencing. Across Concordot systems, decision timing shifted into controlled stochastic variation. No stable rhythm, no consistent delay curve, no pattern continuity. The second distortion pulsed and misaligned. Its simulated overlay lagged actual execution by 3%, then 5%, then 7%. Mara's voice came fast, prediction variance climbing. The entity accelerated simulation density. Its mirrored overlays flickered in faster succession, trying to catch rhythm that no longer existed. But stochastic modulation denied clean mapping. The ripple's projection field destabilized. Its preemptive maneuvers triggered too early, then too late. Stabilization executed before predicted interference. Arbitration systems adjusted without visible simulation preface. Markets dampened at irregular intervals. Vorek's voice cut across. It destabilizes its own projection density. Because predictive modeling requires coherence. Incorrect modeling compounds internal error. Jason delivered the replay line evenly. It can model logic. A beat. It cannot model will. The secondary distortion thinned visibly, not retreating, struggling to re-establish predictive lock. The first ripple, which had remained stationary, suddenly pulsed once, harder than before, not mirroring, projecting. Deep field sensors flared red. Mara's voice dropped quietly, energy density increasing along primary distortion. The dome zoomed outward. The first ripple's gravitational signature thickened, not spreading, concentrating. Vorek's pupils constricted sharply. "That is not observation." Jason nodded once. "No." A beat. "That is preparation." The secondary distortion stabilized slightly under reduced projection strain. Both ripples now held position, one recalibrating, one compressing. Ward asked quietly, "What does compression indicate?" Jason answered evenly, "Transition." The chamber understood. Modeling phase was ending. Operational phase beginning. Vorek turned slightly towards Jason. "You anticipated inversion." Jason shook his head once. "I anticipated pressure." Ward held his gaze. "And now we follow your tempo." There it was. Not praise, acknowledgement, strategic reliance. Jason did not react outwardly, but the chamber saw the shift. The first ripple pulsed again, this time sending a faint wave through outer sensor nets. 3 long-range probes went dark, not offline, gone. No debris, no signal, just absence. Silence filled the chamber. Jason watched the expanding void marker. It has finished learning. A beat, and it no longer needs to measure. The two distortions aligned, not overlapping, parallel, watching the Concordot from different vectors. The board had changed. Because modeling failed, so now execution would begin, and this time it would not be subtle.
The first ripple did not expand. It compressed. Across the projection dome, the distortion collapsed inward into a tight gravitational singularity node, space bending visibly around it. Not spreading, concentrating. Mara's voice cut through the chamber, energy density exceeding all previous modeling thresholds. Jason's eyes narrowed. It's committing. Vorek's bioluminescent patterns flared sharply. Target vector. The dome recalibrated. The singularity did not align with trade corridors, not with distributed lanes,
not with civilian infrastructure. It aligned with the Concordate Core Archive. Silence fell like impact. The Core Archive contained the foundation of interstellar law, species charters, defense pacts, arbitration precedent, sovereignty treaties. Erase it, and the Concordate would fracture overnight. Ward spoke first. It's targeting our legitimacy. Jason answered calmly. It wants institutional collapse. The singularity pulsed. The archive's outer hull shimmered under sudden gravitational shear. Internal decks trembled. Microfractures spidered across structural ribs. Mara's voice hardened. Archive integrity dropping 2% per pulse. Inside the station, crew telemetry appeared on the dome. Civilian archivists, judicial clerks, data stewards. Heart rate spiking. Some fell as artificial gravity fluctuated violently. Vorek's voice sharpened. Deploy fleet interdiction. Jason immediately spoke. Negative. Ward turned sharply. Jason. Another pulse. Hull plating warped visibly. A primary data vault blinked red. Checksum verification failure. One treaty cluster corrupted. Gone. Liuma dimmed. Historical data loss confirmed. There it was. Not almost. Actual loss. Jason didn't flinch. It's not targeting archives. A beat. It's targeting continuity. Mara's voice rose. 90 seconds until structural cascade. Vorek's tone cut harder. What is your solution? Jason stepped forward. Detach it. Silence. Ward stared at him. You want to sever the core archive from fixed orbital anchors? Yes. That will destabilize structural equilibrium. Yes. But remove fixed coordinate density. The ripple pulsed again. Another data cluster vanished. This time a founding trade charter between 3 species. The chamber felt it. Not just infrastructure, memory. Vorek's bioluminescent patterns flared violently. If detachment fails, the station fragments. Jason met his gaze steadily. If we don't detach, it's erased. The singularity tightened further. Space warped visibly around the archive. Internal corridors cracked under stress. Crew brace alarms echoed across the projection feed. Ward's voice lowered. Execute. The chamber transformed into synchronized action. Anchor pylons disengaged simultaneously. Massive gravitic clamps released in a cascading sequence. For a split second, the archive twisted under its own mass. Hull stress alarms screamed. One exterior ring fractured. Debris sheared off into orbit. Mara's voice cut sharply. Structural integrity at 68%. Jason spoke clearly. Krexarian stabilizers absorb lateral momentum. Red gravitic beams lanced outward, catching the drifting station's rotation. Thessian harmonic counterspin. Crystalline resonance fields stabilized torsional oscillation. Terran dampeners flattened vertical shear. Blue gravitic waves suppressed cascading resonance spikes. The archive tore free from its fixed orbit, unanchored, drifting, but intact. The singularity flared violently, then destabilized. Without fixed coordinate mass, its shear gradient lost lock. The gravitational spike fractured into chaotic ripples. The chamber watched the singularity unravel in visible layers. Mara exhaled. Gravitational coherence collapsing. Jason delivered the line evenly. It anchored to certainty. A beat. We removed certainty. The immediate threat receded, but cost was visible. Archive exterior ring destroyed. 2 data clusters permanently lost. Crew injuries confirmed. Ward's voice softened, barely. We've displaced the legal heart of the Concordate. Jason nodded. Better displaced than erased. Ward turned toward him. You anticipated governance as a target. Jason shook his head once. I anticipated escalation. Ward held his gaze. And you prepared. This time, he did not deflect. He did not answer. The silence confirmed it. A new alert cut through the chamber. Mara's voice shifted tone. Secondary distortion accelerating. The dome pivoted. The second ripple no longer hovered at observation distance. It was converging, trajectory fixed, target lock tightening. Ward's eyes narrowed. Vector? Mara answered slowly. Earth. Not civilian markets, not distributed lanes. Human stellar command. Jason's gaze didn't waver. It's targeting the architect. Vorek's pupils constricted sharply. It identifies you as the destabilizing variable. Jason folded his newspaper once, calm, controlled.
It identifies unpredictability. The second distortion intensified rapidly, energy density climbing beyond archive strike levels. Outer Terran sensor nets flickered. 2 deep field monitoring arrays went dark, not corrupted, gone. Ward's voice lowered. Jason. He didn't look away from the projection. Prepare full spectrum defense. The chamber braced. The first ripple had tested infrastructure. The second had tested modeling. Now it was targeting the source of disruption itself. Mara's voice cut sharply, energy density surpassing archive event threshold. Jason's jaw tightened, barely visible. Then it's done learning. The distortion flared, and human stellar command's outer perimeter shields shimmered under distant gravitational stress, not impact, pressure. The modeling phase had ended, the strike phase had begun, and this time it wasn't about corridors, it wasn't about trade, it wasn't about governance. It was about removing the variable that refused to behave predictably. The war had been a distraction, the corridor had been rehearsal, the archive had been proof. Now it was execution, and Earth was the target.
The second distortion did not strike immediately. It tightened. Across the projection dome, the gravitational density surrounding Earth intensified in layered compression bands. Not explosive, surgical. Mara's voice came low and steady. Outer defense perimeter experiencing harmonic destabilization. Jason did not move. Impact vector. Not physical, Mara replied. It's targeting field coherence. President Ward stood. Define. Jason answered calmly. It's trying to desynchronize our shields. A pulse rippled outward from the second distortion. Human stellar command's outer gravitic barrier shimmered violently. 2 auxiliary platforms lost alignment and drifted. No debris, but destabilized. Vorek's voice cut through. Reinforcement fleet mobilizing. Jason shook his head once. Negative. Ward looked at him sharply. Jason. If we escalate fleet density near Earth, we increase target mass. A beat. It wants mass. Silence. Another pulse. This one deeper. Human stellar command flickered violently. For half a second, the chamber lost full spectrum feed. The blinding darkness returned. Mara's voice came back first. Visual restored. But something had changed. Energy density around Earth had not dispersed. It was threading. Thin gravitational filaments began extending towards orbital infrastructure. Not crushing, infiltrating. Jason exhaled once. It's not trying to destroy Earth. Vorek's pupils narrowed. Then what? It's trying to isolate it. Ward understood instantly, severing us from the network. Yes, not annihilation. Disconnection. If Earth became gravitationally isolated, contingency grids would fragment, randomization cycles would collapse, the variable would become predictable. Mara's voice sharpened, field coherence degrading in concentric bands. Jason stepped forward. Engage inversion protocol. The chamber froze. Ward's eyes flickered. That protocol is theoretical. Yes. It also collapses our own shield stability. Yes. Vorek's bioluminescent patterns flared. You would destabilize your homeworld intentionally. Jason met his gaze. It cannot isolate what refuses to remain fixed. Another pulse. 3 Terran orbital habitats reported structural vibration spikes. Civilian heart rate telemetry surged across the dome. This time, the fear was visible. Ward's voice lowered. Jason. He did not look at her. If we hold formation, it learns Earth's defensive geometry. A beat. If we destabilize voluntarily, it loses lock. Silence. Vorek spoke first. What is required? Jason answered cleanly. Simultaneous shield phase inversion across all Terran orbital nodes. Thessian harmonic interference to mask frequency. Krexar external stabilizers to absorb recoil. Ward didn't hesitate. Execute. Across Earth orbit, gravitic shields inverted phase polarity. For a split second, human stellar command's defensive grid collapsed inward. Not gone, inverted.
The second distortion surged, expecting isolation geometry. Instead, it encountered non-linear inversion chaos. Thessian harmonic resonance flooded orbital space. Krexar stabilizers absorbed violent recoil waves. Volari gravitic dampeners prevented orbital drift cascade. The distortion's isolating filaments misaligned. They snapped against inverted polarity bands. Energy density destabilized. Mara's voice rose. Field lock failing. Jason spoke evenly. It anchored to coherence. A beat. We removed coherence. The second distortion flared violently, then fractured. Not dispersing like the first, splintering into erratic gravitational arcs. Outer probe arrays registered massive energy instability. Vorek's pupils constricted. It is collapsing its own containment. Because isolating Earth required fixed geometry. Earth had refused to remain fixed. The distortion finned, retreated, then stopped. Not gone, pulling back beyond operational range. The chamber held silence. Earth's shield slowly restabilized. Orbital habitats reported structural integrity restored. Civilian telemetry normalized. Ward exhaled slowly. We survived. Jason did not relax. No. A beat. We adapted. Vorek turned toward him. You forced it into escalation. Jason shook his head once. It forced itself. Lauma shimmered faintly. It underestimated variance. Ward looked at Jason steadily. You anticipated personal targeting. He paused, just long enough for the chamber to feel it. Yes, that was the burden. Not surprise. Preparation. Sareth's voice resonated through the chamber. The Concordat stands because of Terran contingency. There it was. Formal recognition. Authority shift locked. Voret added quietly. The Empire acknowledges strategic dependence. Not surrender. Dependence. Jason said nothing. Because dominance did not require repetition. The projections zoomed outward. Both distortions lingered at distant range. Reduced. Recalculating. Not defeated, learning under new constraints. Mara's voice cut in one final time. Jason, deep field arrays detecting signal divergence beyond both distortions. The dome expanded further. Beyond the two fading anomalies, a faint lattice pattern flickered. Not gravitational, structured, ordered, massive. Jason's eyes narrowed slightly. That's not a weapon. Ward asked quietly. Then what is it? Jason answered evenly. It's architecture. Silence thickened. Because architecture meant planning, not invasion, preparation. Vorak spoke low. You believe these distortions are extensions? Yes. Of what? Jason held the projection. Something that builds pressure before it builds presence. The war was a distraction. The corridor was rehearsal. Governance was leverage. Earth was calibration. The distortions were not attackers, they were scouts, and scouts reported back. Jason delivered the final line calmly. It hasn't arrived yet. The lattice flickered once more in deep space, far beyond current reach, stable, waiting, and this time,
Humanity was watching first.